As a child, Oliver never felt alone in his family's old farmhouse. His parents often told him the house had been passed down through generations, but the whispers in the walls, the strange creaks, and the cold spots always made him feel as though someone, was watching him. His younger sister, Lily, was the first to notice the shadow in the attic. At night, she would talk about it in hushed whispers, describing the tall, dark figure lurking above. At first, their parents dismissed it as imagination, chalking it up to childhood fears. But soon, Oliver began to see things too. Small objects would disappear from the house, only to reappear in the attic. Footsteps in the hallway would echo, even though everyone was asleep. And sometimes, late at night, he would hear the low, guttural whispering that seemed to call his name. One evening, when he was around 12 years old, Oliver decided to confront the source of these strange occurrences. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy dose of adolescent bravado, he ventured into the attic. The air was cold, thick with dust and the smell of old wood. As he climbed up the stairs, the whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. At the far end of the attic was a small, cracked window that let in a faint, pale light. Oliver's heart raced as he crept toward the corner where he had heard the sounds of movement. The floorboards creaked under his feet. He turned the corner, and there, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It wasn't human, or at least not entirely. The figure had long, twisted limbs, pale skin that glistened in the dim light, and hollow, empty eyes that seemed to see right through him. Before Oliver could react, the figure lunged at him, its fingers wrapped around his neck, its cold, clammy touch suffocating him. He struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the creature's grip was unyielding. He saw flashes of his childhood, the warm memories of playing with Lily, of laughing in the fields, of innocence. But those memories were quickly fading, replaced by an overwhelming sense of terror. Just as Oliver's vision began to blur, he heard a faint scream from the bottom of the stairs. It was Lily's voice. The figure's grip loosened, and Oliver fell to the ground, gasping for air. The creature turned toward the stairs, its body jerking unnaturally as it moved. Oliver scrambled to his feet and ran down the stairs, but when he reached the bottom, the house was empty. Lily was gone. Weeks passed, and the house became even more sinister. Lily never returned, and Oliver was left to grapple with the realization that his sister had been taken by whatever had lived in that attic. His parents seemed distant, no longer able to provide comfort. The house grew colder, the whispers louder. In a desperate attempt to uncover the truth, Oliver revisited the attic, this time determined to confront whatever lurked there. But when he opened the door, he found something far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The attic was no longer an attic. It was a hollow, black void that seemed to stretch on forever. And there, at the far end, stood Lily. But she wasn't the same. Her eyes were black, her body twisted and unnatural. Her skin stretched tight across her bones. She reached out to him, her mouth opening wide as if to speak, but all that came out was a guttural, inhuman growl. Oliver knew then that whatever had taken his sister was not human, and it was far worse than he had ever imagined. He ran from the house that night, leaving everything behind. He never returned, and over the years the farmhouse was left to rot, the whispers slowly fading into silence. As an adult, Oliver still struggles with the memories of that night, the terror of the attic, and the haunting feeling that whatever was waiting for him in that dark, forsaken space is still out there, waiting to claim him once more. It was the kind of place that no one in their right mind would visit at night. The old bridge on Ridgeway Road had long been abandoned after a tragic accident in the late 70s, when a bus, full of children, had plunged into the river below. The bridge was barely passable now, the wood warped and cracked, and the rusted metal beams barely holding together. People in the small town whispered about the haunting that followed the accident, but no one dared to go near it. Samantha, 26 years old, grew up hearing the stories. As a child, she had always been curious, Intrigued by the urban legends her grandmother would tell her about Ridgeway Road. But as she grew older, she dismissed them as mere folklore. That is, until one fateful night, when the dark urge to see the bridge for herself overcame her. Samantha had just broken up with her boyfriend, and the pain from the split was like a constant gnawing ache in her chest. She couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. She was drawn to the idea of testing herself, of proving she wasn't afraid of ghost stories or the terrifying myths of the bridge. She grabbed her camera, some flashlights, and drove toward the edge of town. As she approached the bridge, the air grew colder. She could feel her breath becoming visible in the car, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. When she stepped out of her car, the world felt unnervingly still. No sounds of nature, no wind, just absolute silence. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The bridge was even worse than she had imagined. The dark wooden planks groaned under her feet as she walked slowly across, the faint rustling of something nearby making her jump at every turn. She scanned the area with her flashlight, its beam cutting through the heavy darkness, revealing nothing but the twisted shadows of dead trees surrounding her. Suddenly she heard a faint giggle. She froze, her heart racing. She turned, scanning the bridge and the surrounding woods for any sign of movement. There was nothing. She thought she must be imagining things. Maybe the stress of her breakup had gotten to her. But then she heard it again, louder this time. The unmistakable sound of children laughing. Samantha's blood ran cold. She had read about the children who had died in the bus accident, but she didn't think the legend was true. Yet, the laughter, soft but clear, continued. It was coming from the other end of the bridge. Against every instinct screaming at her to leave, Samantha slowly crept forward, towards the source of the sound. The closer she got, the more intense the laughter became, until it was echoing in her ears, filling her head. She could see a figure now, a small childlike silhouette standing near the edge of the bridge, just beyond the reach of her flashlight. Her pulse quickened as she called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond, but it slowly turned toward her. It was a little girl, no older than 7 or 8, dressed in what appeared to be an old-fashioned school uniform, her hair tangled and wild. Her eyes, however, were what terrified Samantha the most. They were completely black, devoid of any whites or irises, just endless voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. Before Samantha could react, the girl smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide, twisted, and unnatural, stretching far too wide for a human mouth. Samantha stepped back in fear, but the girl didn't move. Instead, she spoke in a voice that was disturbingly calm, like a child playing a game. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice echoing in the empty space around them. Samantha turned to run, but as she did, she stumbled over the edge of the bridge, and the ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell into the river below, her body crashing against the jagged rocks. For a few moments, everything was black. When Samantha awoke, she was lying on the riverbank, drenched and covered in mud. She struggled to her feet, the pain in her head blurring her thoughts, and when she looked up, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The little girl was standing on the bridge, watching her, that same wide, twisted grin plastered on her face. But now, she was not alone. Behind her, standing in the shadows, was a crowd of figures, hundreds of them, all children with black eyes and unnatural smiles, staring down at Samantha. Samantha ran. She didn't care where she was going. She just needed to get away from them. She didn't stop until she reached her car. As she sped back to town, she glanced in her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the children following her. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching behind her. When Samantha arrived home, she collapsed into her bed, exhausted and traumatized. She didn't speak to anyone for days, and when she did, she couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth. She kept hearing the laughter, the voices of the children calling her name in. Tom and his brother David had always been close. Growing up, they shared everything: games, books, and even friends. But there was one thing David didn't share: a deep, irrational fear of their childhood home. From the moment they moved in, David was different. He was quieter, more reserved. Tom, however, found the house fascinating. It was old, decaying, and stood at the very edge of Elm Street, surrounded by overgrown trees and a thick mist that seemed to always linger around the house. The local townspeople often spoke in hushed tones about it, warning anyone who would listen to stay away. But of course, Tom never believed in such superstitions. One night, after their parents had gone out for dinner, Tom convinced David to stay up and watch a movie with him in the living room. The house creaked and groaned, as old houses tend to do, but tonight it felt different. There was an odd stillness in the air, an oppressive weight that made the hair on the back of Tom's neck stand up. "It's just the house," Tom reassured David as the wind howled outside, the rain beating against the windows. "You've lived here long enough. Don't let it get to you." But David only shook his head, his eyes darting nervously to the dark corners of the room. "I can't, Tom. I've seen things." "What things?" Tom asked, trying to laugh it off. "Like what?" David hesitated, his face pale in the dim light. "It's the man in the attic." Tom raised an eyebrow. "What man?" "The one who watches me," David whispered, his voice trembling. "He's up there, Tom. I've seen him. And he's not normal." Tom rolled his eyes, trying to stay calm. "David, there's no man in the attic. You're just imagining things. This house is old, that's all." But David wasn't convinced. As the night wore on, Tom began to feel an unsettling presence in the room. The air seemed to grow heavier, the silence deafening. It wasn't until the wind picked up again, rattling the windows, that the unsettling feeling was finally broken. A sudden thud came from above. Heavy footsteps. Tom froze. "There it is again," David whispered, his face pale. Tom ignored his brother's fears, thinking it was just the old house settling. "Probably just the wind, David. Let's just finish the movie, okay?" But the footsteps continued, louder now, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scraping against the wooden floor above them. David bolted upright, his face contorted in terror. "I told you!" Tom stood, trying to shake off the feeling of dread creeping into his own chest. "It's nothing. I'm going to check it out." Tom made his way upstairs, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached the top, the air turned colder, and the dim light from the hallway flickered. He made his way to the attic door, which was slightly ajar, as if waiting for him. He pushed it open, but the darkness beyond seemed to swallow the light, and he hesitated. "Tom, don't open that door," David's voice called from below. But Tom had already stepped inside. The attic was empty, save for old furniture covered in sheets and forgotten boxes. Yet, in the far corner, something caught his eye. A faint shadow flickered in the darkness, and as he approached, he felt a chill run down his spine. There, sitting in the corner of the room, was a figure, motionless, but unmistakable. It was a man, slouched forward, as though he were waiting for something, or someone. "Tom, what are you doing?" David screamed from downstairs. Tom couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. There was something wrong about him, something unnatural. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his face was obscured by a dark, ragged hood. But what truly terrified Tom were the eyes, black and empty, staring back at him. Suddenly the figure moved. It jerked to life, its head snapping up with a sharp, unnatural movement. Tom froze in terror. The figure's lips curled into a grotesque smile, revealing a row of sharp, yellowed teeth. Before Tom could react, the door slammed shut behind him, plunging the attic into complete darkness. He could hear the figure's footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer. A cold breath brushed against his neck. Tom sprinted down the stairs, crashing into the walls as he stumbled. He could hear the man's laughter echoing behind him, growing louder, more distorted. He reached the bottom of the stairs and turned to see the figure standing at the doorway, its smile growing wider, its eyes now glowing with an eerie, supernatural light. David was screaming from the living room, but Tom couldn't bring himself to look back. He ran out of the house and into the storm, the figure's presence still looming in his mind. For years after that night, Tom couldn't shake the image of the man in the attic. He eventually moved out of the house, leaving it behind. But when he returned to visit years later, he found the house in an even worse state of decay. The windows were boarded up, the rue. In the quiet, fog-drenched countryside of rural England, the Winston family stumbled upon what seemed to be a dream come true. Ashbourne Manor. With its sprawling gardens and ivy-covered walls, the house was a picturesque escape from their bustling city life. The price was suspiciously low, but the family chalked it up to the home's age and the village's isolation. The realtor, an elderly man named Mr. Huxley, seemed eager to close the deal. He provided a hurried tour, avoiding one narrow corridor on the second floor. When pressed, he merely waved it off. "Old storage area," he said. "The key's been lost for decades." For the Winstons, Thomas, his wife Clara, and their 12-year-old daughter Emily, the mystery added to the house's charm. They moved in within a week, their boxes and furniture swallowed by the cavernous rooms. For the first few days, life was idyllic. Clara busied herself with the garden, Thomas immersed himself in work, and Emily explored every nook and cranny of the manor, except for the locked door at the end of the corridor. The door had an unsettling presence. The peeling paint seemed to shiver under Emily's gaze, and the brass doorknob was ice cold, even in the summer heat. At night, she heard faint, indistinct whispers coming from behind it. She mentioned it to her parents, but they dismissed her concerns as imagination fueled by ghost stories and creaky old wood. One night, the whispers turned to soft sobs. Emily pressed her ear to the door and froze. "Please," a voice whimpered, "let me out." Her scream brought her parents running, but when they checked, the door was silent, its frame as still as death. Thomas inspected the door the next day, giving it a few hard knocks. "See? Solid," he declared, before leaving it at that. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was trapped inside. A week later, while exploring the attic, Emily found a small wooden box. Inside was a tarnished skeleton key, its teeth jagged and sharp. She held it in her hand, feeling a strange warmth emanate from the metal. That night, as the house fell into a hushed slumber, she crept down the corridor, the key tucked tightly in her palm. The key fit perfectly. As it turned, a soft click echoed through the hall. Emily hesitated before pushing the door open. The stench hit her first, a vile mix of mildew and decay. The room was small and windowless, its walls covered in faded, yellowed wallpaper. Etched into the wood beneath the peeling paper were strange symbols, almost alive in the dim moonlight spilling through the corridor. In the center of the room sat a single, decaying rocking horse, its paint chipped and flaking. Beside it lay a teddy bear with one button eye and stuffing spilling from its seams. As Emily stepped further inside, the door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into darkness. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and growing frantic. A shadow moved across the room, coalescing into the shape of a young boy. His hollow eyes locked onto Emily's, and his mouth stretched into a mournful grin. "Why did you leave me here?" he asked, his voice trembling with pain. Emily backed into the wall. I don't know you." "You were supposed to help me," he whispered, stepping closer. "But you forgot." The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsing with an eerie red light. The boy's figure grew more distorted, his limbs elongating unnaturally. His grin widened, revealing jagged teeth. Emily screamed, her voice lost in the cacophony of whispers that filled the room. Meanwhile, Clara and Thomas woke to the sound of Emily's cries. Rushing to the corridor, they found the door locked. Thomas threw his weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. Inside, Emily was frozen as the boy's cold, spectral hand reached for her. "You'll stay with me," he hissed. "No!" Emily shouted, her voice filled with defiance. She grabbed the teddy bear and threw it at the boy. To her shock, the bear burst into flames, and the boy recoiled, shrieking as the room erupted into chaos. The symbols flared brighter, and the walls seemed to close in. The door suddenly swung open, and Thomas and Clara pulled Emily out just as the room imploded with a deafening roar. When they turned back, the door was gone. The corridor ended abruptly, as if the room had never existed. They left Ashbourne Manor the next day, but Emily was never the same. She would stare at mirrors and windows, her reflection sometimes replaced by the boy's haunting grin. Years later, when the manor was demolished, workers uncovered a hidden crawlspace beneath the floorboards. Inside, they found the skeletal remains of a child clutching a teddy bear.